So my name is Darwin. I'm a long-time lurker, first-time presenter here, so bear with me. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the 80-20 of soft skills in data science. And I picked this topic because, one, I've seen a lot of really great technical presentations here, and I know I can't top any of that. So we're going to steer in a different direction and talk about some of the skills that complement those things. And really, I'm somebody who's like in the middle of my career and didn't think I was at the point where I could even give advice to people. And so really this could be kind of repositioned as the 2020 hindsight of things I wish I knew earlier in my career. So yeah, just to kind of just get to know you all a little bit, just out of curiosity, who here is currently working in a data role of some kind, whether it's a data analyst, data scientist? Okay, all right, good chunk of people. Who here is in school studying something data related? All right. Who here is looking for a new job? Okay, so we got a good handful, good group of people, good mix, right? Is anybody here like a manager in data by chance? All right, so yeah, we got a couple of people at all. And yeah, so if you all, especially if something I say doesn't connect with what you say, please like chime in and yeah, let me know kind of about your experience. So just gonna give you a little bit of my career path, so you know where I'm coming from. It's curvy because career paths are never straight. I started as a chemical engineer. I went to college in San Diego, and then that 2010 was a very awful time to graduate college and be looking for jobs. And so, after a couple of years of what kids do after college, I came to Nashville to go to grad school at Vanderbilt. I got my PhD in chemistry in 2018, doing a lot of like molecular modeling, so a lot of computation, predictions for like drug discovery purposes. So nobody called it data science, but it was very data science heavy. And then I kind of switched to a postdoc at Vanderbilt Medical Center. So that's where I started kind of like working with like EHR data, like healthcare and patient and clinical outcomes. And then in 2020, I switched over to my current role, which is a data scientist at a company called KitCheck, which has since rebranded to Bluesight. I still have the same job, but now I am the team lead. And what the company does is basically we help hospitals with their medication compliance, so making sure people are not stealing opioids, which is a big deal right now, and making sure people have access and can purchase the drugs that they need for the hospital. So essentially, very healthcare adjacent, so not clinical outcomes, but definitely working on software that's like vital for what the hospital needs. And in terms of where I want to be, I really enjoy managing. I enjoy thinking about strategy and like, going beyond just like building like individual models, right? And so I would love to head towards like, upper manager, right? A director or VP role one day. So that's kind of like where my mindset is for the next X number of years that I'm going to be working. So, and life is also not just your job. So I'll share a couple of personal things, and you're free to talk to me about any other personal things or ask me about my job. So I'm a big sports fan, love basketball, love tennis, love soccer. So any sports, yeah, come talk to me about it. I love Halloween and dressing up for Halloween. So there's me as the guy from Up. I don't know what I'm doing this year yet, so we'll keep you posted on that. I love to travel. My wife and I just travel all the world. We went to New Zealand recently, which is an awesome, awesome place. Yep, I should mention I have a wife. We got married in 2020. She is a nonprofit consultant. So if you have questions about nonprofits, I can also connect you there. This is probably her favorite fact about me is I was on Jeopardy once. One single episode of Jeopardy where I got second place, but it was still a very awesome and cool experience. And the last thing, this kind of I realize now, putting this at the end with the question marks makes it seem like it's a premonition of my passing, which is not what I intended for this to be at all. But this is actually me pretending to be dead on a stage because I do improvisational comedy as a hobby on the side. So, and that will come back later in the presentation. All right, so the principle we're talking about today is the 80-20 rule, right? And the soft skills. So how many people here are familiar with the 80-20 rule? Okay, so we got a couple of people, a handful of people. So 80-20 rule is also called the Pareto principle. It's named for an Italian mathematician who back in the day noticed that his garden, about 80% of the peas that he was getting came from about 20% of the plants. right? That's where it started. And then he kind of like, okay, well, let me look at a bigger deal, something that's a bigger deal. And he noticed about 80% of the land in Italy at the time was owned by 20% of the people, right? And so it's the idea that there is a very, very powerful minority that accounts for the most of something, right? And so, you might also hear about this as like the low-hanging fruit, where if you've done any sort of, feature engineering, at some point you probably have seen a graph, produce a graph that looks something like this, right? Where you have one or two features that kind of dominate the effects that you're seeing, right? So there's a lot of different ways of phrasing what this rule is. And the way that I'm kind of phrasing it for this presentation tonight is the 20% of the effort that gets you 80% of the result, right? So what are the low-hanging fruits that you can do in terms of soft skills to kind of help you get you where you're going, right? It won't get you all the way there, right? But it will help you if you're not taking those steps now, right? So the first kind of set of rules I'm going to go through is the 80-20 of finding a job, right? And these will, apply beyond just finding a job as well, right? But there's some things that I've learned from my interviewing and also my process of now that, I am a manager getting to hire people, right? And in terms of my job hunting experience, this was a graph I made back after my job hunt in 2020. So I submitted about 80 applications, and you see most of them I was rejected for, which I know if you're looking for a job now, you might think those are rookie numbers, and yeah, it's probably agree. But that's kind of the experience I'm drawing from. And the first one that I like to talk about a little bit is making your experience relevant, right? And the reason I thought about this is because when I was first looking for jobs, I was getting so much advice about like, do a Kaggle competition, right? Go on GitHub, load a bunch of notebooks, right? Make a personal website that lists a bunch of projects, right? And those are all really good things, but I'm also a lazy person sometimes. And and no matter like how many new things that you try to add, ultimately when you're interviewing, what's on your resume when you're interviewing, the majority is going to be the experience that you already have, right? Like you're not going to be able to in that 2 weeks magically add a whole bunch of experience, right? That makes it so much more relevant, right? So it's about kind of pivoting your experience to make it relevant, right, for the job that you're looking for. And my example here comes from, so I had to pivot from academia, right? And I went back to the resumes that I submitted. And this was on one of the first resumes I submitted. It's a paper I published in 2018. Just, you can read the title. And, if you're looking for a professor, you're looking for a postdoc fellow, right? That's a great way of listing that on your resume, right? It's a very standard CV entry, right? But when I put that on job resume, nobody cares, right? HR doesn't know what that means, right? They don't know what it's about, right? So I had to kind of like pivot and reframe that project, right? And this is how I kind of put it on the next iteration, right, of my resume, right? So kind of just highlighting exactly what I accomplished, what skills you use, right? What are the things that you're looking for, right? Um, and then I thought about this a little bit further, and I was like, well, what am I really trying to say, right? And what I'm really trying to say here is, hey, I know R, and I know Python, I know C++, and I know SQL, right? And so ultimately, that is a section I added to my resume, right, just to make it like, hey, these are the skill sets I have, right? And obviously, during the interview, you kind of have to like back yourself up and be like, hey, this is how I use it, right? This is kind of my experience with it. And if you have a technical challenge, you have to do it. But it's about kind of like taking what you already done and presenting it in a way that is very easy for people to understand. And I even applied for a job that was like completely out of left field. And for that one, it's the exact same project. I think it was some sort of cancer foundation. So it was a real desperate time, and I was so that's what I went with at that time. Oh. Yeah, does that one kind of make sense to people? I'm curious if anybody has any other thoughts about pivoting your experience. Right. All right. The next one I want to talk about is making your interview a conversation, right? And this goes, in all kinds of feedback, in meetings as well, right? And it's the idea of there's so many interviews I've done back in the day where, it starts with like, oh, tell me about yourself, right? You answer that question, and there was like 5 or 6 more questions by the interviewer, right? And then at the very end, 3 minutes left. What questions do you have for me, right? And you try to fit in like 2 questions. You're like, oh, okay, sorry, can I go over time a little bit, right? And it's such a weird concept to me because in no other setting would you go up to a stranger and be like, tell me about yourself, and expect them to give you their entire work history, right? And then you will follow that up by asking another question for which they give you a whole history, right? And at a job interview, that's the same thing, right? This is going to be somebody that you're going to be working with, right? And that's not, I mean, how you get to know people when you're working with them. It's not how, how a lot of job interviews are structured, right? And so the idea is, really thinking about the interview as a conversation and not an interrogation, right? Um, and yeah, and so that, and some of that is just kind of, goes back and forth between like, getting your questions in there earlier, right? Like if people are asking you about, experience, like, hey, how do you deal with fast deadlines? How do you deal, with prioritizing when there's changing deadlines, right? You can answer with an example and then go right back and be like, hey, do you all have a lot of changing deadlines that you're experiencing, right? What do you see as the causes of that, right? And I'm sure the manager will love to tell you all the issues that he is dealing with or she is dealing with, right? Um, and that's how you start a conversation, right? You kind of learn about the questions as you go along. So does that kind of resonate with people, right? And my managers out there, right? So that seems about right. Great. All right, and then the last one, and this one really resonated with me, is learning to answer a question that you don't know the answer to. Obviously the opposite of that is to know everything. If you ever taken a personality test, I am an INTJ on the Briggs Myers. If you do the Enneagram, I'm a type 5. So trying to know everything, that is like my mission in life. I'm sitting there at night on the Wikipedia, right, learning about how pendulums work. Um, and but for a job interview, like you can study all the study guides of data science out there. You're never going to know everything. You're going to get asked a question you don't know the answer to, right? Especially when you're applying for one of those job descriptions where it's like, hey, you need to know these 4 languages or these 3 languages or experience in this, right? There's no way to really know at the top how which ones are the most critical ones, right? So I'm going to give it a little example here. All right. Does anybody know a language called FIBAS for streaming data analytics? Anybody? All right, great. If anybody raised their hands, is going to be concerned because that is actually the name of a Pokemon, which I had an AI make up a fake logo for. So nobody should know this language because it doesn't exist, right? So you might get asked in an interview, right? What is your experience with using FIBAS for data streaming, right? And FIBAS could be listed as one of those things like, hey, data streaming experience with X, Y, and Z, right? So you want to try, like, how would you answer this question if you were asked in an interview? Let's say you know that it's used for data streaming, but that's all you know about it.
I would try to relate to something that I do, or try to like work it into a conversation.
Right, exactly, right? Right, yeah. And yeah, that's basically the gist of it, right? Like making sure, like first you can think aloud, right? Buy yourself a little time, take a sip of water, right? And you can like pivot it to something that you do know, right? Like I'm not, right? I haven't worked with FIBAS directly, but at my current role, I'm responsible for setting up streaming data pipelines with Kinesis and Apache Flink, right? I'm eager to learn a new technology, and I'm curious, how did you all choose FIBAS as your choice of streaming technologies, right? And so just kind of like being able to pivot and kind of direct yourself towards something that you do know, right? And that's kind of, and getting that conversation going, right? All right, so to sum up our 3 for finding a job, right? So making your experience relevant, making your interview a conversation, and answering a question you don't know. All right, so somebody else have anything else they would like to add to that list that they have found really helpful?
Got a question in chat.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat.
It's how can I make SQL development experience relevant for a data scientist role?
All right. So there's a question called, not a question called, it says, how can I make my SQL development experience relevant for a data scientist role? So so correct me if this is not what you meant for the question on the chat. But I think SQL is probably the most important of all the languages for data science, right? Like you're almost certainly going to be pulling from databases, right? You're going to be, you're not going to know all the varieties, right? But whether you know MySQL, like Redshift, whatever it is that you do know, right? That's bread and butter, right? Like when I do a technical interview, like my first question is SQL based, right? Like I want to make sure you know that in and out because that's critical for data science. So actually, I think that's arguably the most important language. And then, there's some variety between like Python and R and all of that jazz. But Yeah.
How would you handle a question that you get in an interview that's somewhat designed to stump you and see how you think, see if you like panic or, you know, I don't know, I mean, you covered that a little bit, but I mean, like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think so talking it through is really important. I will say I hate answering questions at interviews when people are like, can you define sensitivity and specificity for me? Right? Like I am so bad at recall. Like no point in my job is anyone ever going to ask me that question, right? And usually, hopefully, the person doing the hiring also knows that, right? If they don't, right, that then there's nothing you can do about that, right? And generally, what I try to do is at least like talk through the idea, right? Like even if I can't define, sensitivity and specificity immediately, I'd be like, okay, I know that's, that comes from like a confusion matrix, right? Which we'll actually get to in a second. That comes from a confusion matrix, right? You're trying to evaluate how good your model is performing, right? Sensitivity, I believe, relates to this. Specificity, I believe, relates to this, right? And just essentially sharing what you know, right, to the best of your ability. So, oh, yeah, but
I was gonna say, kind of following up that is like, the other thing is, I know the market's different, but you're right, like you're learning about the company through the way they kind of answer the question, right? Like if they have a question that's designed to stump you and they only want you to give the right answer, right? Then maybe that's not gonna be a good learning kind of place that they'll encourage. Whereas if it's somebody who like sees that you're stumped and then kind of helps lead you through that, right? Then you're going to learn something about the company. And that's the way I try to look at it, even if I totally want to answer.
Yeah, I appreciate that because I mean, I told some of you guys, but I'm super new to the field. I'm still in school, so I'm going to be in a position where I have a lot of experience from another field, but I'm going to be completely new in an interview. So I was just kind of intimidated by this. So.
yeah, exactly. I mean, like 100% advanced candidates are like, I feel like they will learn and they will try hard. They have demonstrated that they can learn, right? Versus the candidate who just happens to be able to spew off every single, term in data science, right? All right, so the next part here is about the 80-20 of communicating on the job, right? So this is kind of getting a little bit more into, I want to say this is a lot of it relates to my pet peeves, which I think are relatively universal. So the first one is having meetings with agendas and action items, right? How many people here have a meeting every week, right, where you don't have an agenda? All right, okay, yeah, definitely me, right? And you get to the meeting and it's like, it might have, some really important people, but it's like, who's talking about what, right? What are we trying to figure out during this meeting, right? I mentioned earlier, my wife works in nonprofit and like, her organization helps people do strategic plans and do facilitations. Every meeting she has, even like a two-person one-on-one, has an agenda, right? And it's such a game changer. It's so simple, right? If you work in government, like government meetings almost certainly has to have some sort of agenda, right? Like a minutes that gets published at the end as well, right? Having an action item. And so it's just a really, really simple thing to do. And and it's all about just doing it in the circles that you're in, right? You're not going to change company culture, right? But if you have a meeting that doesn't have an agenda, call it out. Be like, hey, what are we doing here today, right? For this call, right? To prepare for it. And one example I think I'll share it's basically for when you have a one-on-one, right? Like a one-on-one, whether it's with your manager or with your employee, there's a really simple format to follow, right? Right. You can, and it's really easy to define, right? Like share your wins, right? What are your big wins since the last time you talked, right? What are challenges that you need help with, right? What support do you need from your manager in the moment, right? And then what are the next steps, right? Like, can you go off and do this? Can I do this, right? And that's it, right? That's 4 steps to define an agenda to one of the most important meetings that you have on your calendar, right? And that goes both ways, whether you're talking about with your direct manager or you're talking about people that you're supervising, right? Obviously, hopefully your direct manager will be receptive to it, right? But it is something that might take time to build that relationship, right? I'll give one shout out to here. So since I started doing manager, I've been doing like management training with and Makita Andrews is somebody. She has a lot of experience. She has like a YouTube channel that has a lot of really helpful videos, and she actually runs a manager training thing all about like running meetings and having clarity and good expectations. And that's something that's been really helpful as a resource. I wanted to shout out. I do not get any sort of referral bonus or anything like that for for you clicking and going and see that video. So. All right, any questions kind of about meetings and agendas? All right, so next one. It's about communicating results directly and being clear of your communications. And notice the thing that you're replacing is the same thing, having more and longer meetings, which is the thing that I'm always trying to avoid. So, you mentioned a confusion matrix earlier, right? So is everyone here relatively familiar with what a confusion matrix is, right? All right, so confusion matrix is used to evaluate the outcome of a model you're building or some sort of prediction you're building, and it evaluates essentially whether or not the things that you're predicting as true, right, is actually true, and the thing that you're predicting as false is actually false. So it allows you to kind of assess how well your models are working, and you have a lot of false positives, which can be a concern. You have a lot of false negatives, which could be a concern. I think during the last couple of years, we all learn a lot about the confusion matrix for COVID tests, right? And what a positive test means and what a negative test means, right? And I think there's definitely a lot of numbers that got thrown around here. And so this is a confusion matrix, right? And so my question here is, how many of you, has anybody here presented a confusion matrix at a project meeting recently? All right, you have? Oh, yeah, 2x2 tables, yeah, contingency tables. Okay, was it for a technical audience or a non-technical audience? Okay, all right, and so they understood it. Okay, has anyone presented one of these matrices to somebody, a non-technical audience recently? All right, so yeah, so maybe you're all a great audience here. So my soapbox is you should never present this to a non-technical audience, right? Because that's not the project update they need. They don't need that level of detail. I've sat through calls with other data scientists who either pull this out or pull up a Jupyter notebook and start scrolling through it with a project manager, right? And that is not the way that's the best way to communicate those results directly, right? And the ultimate goal of communication is making sure your results are heard, right? All right, and since you all are pretty on top of things, right? So, okay, so as an example, we're giving an update to a project manager. And so this particular confusion matrix is about if you're looking at, you have a predictive algorithm that looks at whether staff members are in compliance with policy, right? And if they're not in compliance with policy, maybe their managers need to take some sort of action, right? So let's say, in the first use case, somebody is looking to investigate each staff member who gets flagged, right? So it gets flagged as having a compliance issue. And it's a big waste of their time, right? If they're investigating the wrong people, because it's a lot of work to investigate a particular person, right? So how might you present the results of this confusion matrix or the results of your model building to this project manager? For the people that, I guess, yeah, understand the graph. Anybody? So are the red boxes, okay. What is the most important stat on here, I guess? Right, so you're looking at people who are, sorry, cursor's over here, right? So present as flagged, right? And then, so you're predicting 51 of them, right? As you're saying, these people need to be investigated, and and they do need to be investigated. You're predicting 8 people who don't need to be investigated, so this is a waste of their time, right? And then, so the stat you need is the precision, right? 86.4%, right? So you might say like, hey, this is a great model, right? Like that, and that's all you need to communicate, right? 86.4%. Find the number that you need to share so that they can make the decisions that they need to make, right? And I have another scenario, which is basically in the case where, hey, what if this person's just trying to use ChatGPT and send an email to everybody, and they literally don't care how accurate it is, but they want to make sure you find everybody they need to send an email to, right? Now, in this case, right, the most important number is the recall, right? So basically, of all 140 or so people, right, that needs to be notified, you're only finding 51 of them, right? So it's probably not a good number to go for, right? And so the idea here is really kind of focusing on making sure making sure you know the use cases, right? And just presenting that single number that tells them what to do next, right? Does that kind of make sense? And I realized the irony of me having just presented a confusion matrix during a thing about not presenting confusion matrices. I promise this is the only one. All right. So the last bit I think that that's really important is knowing who is going to make the decision. When you present results or project updates, know who has the power to make the decision on what happens next. And this is, again, something I've learned from my wife and her nonprofit work, right? And like a very common organizational thing, it's called a RACI chart, right? I don't know, some people probably have heard of it, right? It's the idea that basically with each decision, you can assign somebody, right, who is responsible for making that decision and other people who know about that decision, right? And a very simple, a very simple version of that is you can also think of it as a decision tree model, different decision tree than a data science one, right? It's the idea that there's some decisions the staff could just make, right? You just decide it and that's it. Maybe your manager doesn't even need to know about it, right? That could be like if you choose to use, I don't know, some sort of feature selection algorithm or something like that, right? Your boss probably doesn't even need to know about that. You just decide it, right? And then there's that middle tier, right, where you make a decision, but you need to inform your boss, right? And that maybe that could be like the choice of model, for example, right? Maybe that's something that they're interested in, right? Maybe like exactly kind of like the architecture that you need to build, right? And the next tier is the trunk decisions, right? So they're getting down to the core, right? Something you decide the manager approves, right? Maybe maybe it's about going to whether we should productionize this product or something like that, right? And then the last one is where you're recommending something and your boss decides, right? And I'm saying boss here, but it could be like a project manager as well, right? But it's the idea that like, hey, maybe you're saying like, we're gonna go forward with this, right? And I recommend that we set a timeline of 2 months for this, right? And your manager is gonna have to take that information and decide it, right? And so this is really helpful in any situation where you find yourself going in circles looking for approval, right? I'll give an example of like, we put in our very first data retention policy at our company. We're a relatively young company, right? And we had to go around and at first we try to go around the room to every single group of stakeholder and be like, hey, are you cool with this? Are you cool with this? Right? Are you okay if we do this? And that basically just, does not work, right? Everyone's got a different opinion. Everyone wants a different thing, right? And then we kind of divided up the group and said, hey, these people get to have an opinion, right? These people get to actually make the final decision. And then these people we just tell, right? Even though they're stakeholders and it's important to them, they don't get to have a say in it, right? You just inform them, that's the decision that you made, right? And so having this kind of concept of who is making the decision on your projects is something that's really important. And just, if you ever find yourself spiraling, like, make it clear, right? Make it clear with the people that you're working with. All right, so those are kind of my three of on the job communication. Does anybody, have anything that they want to add to it or thoughts about it? Yeah.
Spend management. It sounds so simple when you're just saying it, but if you have multiple projects going on, it's so easy to get lost in the mud. And you have multiple people in each project. You have 10, 15 people in each one. So.
Yeah. And a lot of it is like organizational culture, right? Like if you have good organizational culture, it already happens. But if you don't, then you have to find the room where you can make those small improvements, right? Just start small, right?
Yeah. You bring the right person into a meeting, you could turn a 2-hour meeting into a 5-minute decision because that person's the one that's making a decision anyway. And you could waste a bunch of time talking to people that's not going to make a decision.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And that's great experience for when you apply for data science. There you go. Productivity, current experience. All right, so the last plug I will make is you might be thinking, for people who are maybe more introverted, and I am an introvert, how do you practice soft skills, right? Besides just going out and talking to a bunch of people. And this is where I will make a plug for something I mentioned earlier, and that is the fun of improv. So improv is basically, you might think of it as like whose lines anyway, something silly to do on stage. But part of that silliness is something that we could use in everyday life, right? And there's tons and tons of different programs that does like corporate trainings on communication for improv, whether it's, really helpful. I do believe it's helpful, but it's also good fun sometimes, just to have a laugh. And it doesn't involve going on stage and performing unless you want to. And I will shout out one organization that is near and dear to my heart. It's called Unscripted, that does improv training, both like classes for individual people for like communication, and also does corporate training for groups. Yeah, so I'm happy to talk about this with anybody at any time. So I will also plug that for, and that's the end of my presentation. So if anybody has questions, or I'll just open up if there's questions. If not, then we can all have more pizza and we'll just hang out and chat. So. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Opportunities and working through whether it's day-to-day opportunities. A big part of things is saying no to things.
Yeah.
And so how do you determine when to say no to things, and what's your process of saying yes?
Yeah, good question. So the question, kind of for the corner of the room, I don't know if you all heard, is basically kind of what's the process of saying no to projects, I'm assuming, right? And like to responsibilities in general, right? And kind of what's my process for saying yes, right? So I think, and this is actually kind of goes back to improv, right? One of the first rules of improv, if you've heard of it, is called yes and, right? Say yes, right? And that's a mindset that I try to go into things with, right? Like even if I can't directly help somebody immediately, like trying to understand what their needs are and see if I can connect them to a different resource who can help them, right? And you know, when we think about like no and yes, like that's very binary, but there's very different levels of yes and no, right? Like no, I can't deliver this project in a week, but I'm happy to think about it for our next roadmap planning, right? Those are very different levels of no, right? And same with yes, right? Like yes, I could do this immediately. Yes, I can do this next week, right? And you know, as long as you're on the same team and you're like working towards the same goals, and like, you know, you have to have an assumption that everyone's acting in good faith, right? Like finding that middle ground of like, you know, even if you have to say no, how can you like help or like keep that in mind? I think goes a long way, kind of just smoothing that relationship. So, yeah. Cool. Any other questions?
Do you have any best practices from academics that you see more in the world?
Yeah, that's a good question. So somebody asked if I have best practices from academia that I wish I saw in the corporate world. I can definitely think of a lot that goes the other way. There's a huge list of that. You know, I would say probably the main one is kind of like taking ownership of ideas and not just saying like this isn't my job. I think that, you know, because in academia you have limited resources, right? Like if you're a grad student, right, you're writing papers, you're like doing the experiment, right? You're managing a project, right? You're handling communication, right? Whereas if you go to the corporate world, right, you might have a project manager that manages the project, right? You might write the code. Somebody else might email the customers. You might have account managers or customer success, right? But it really helps to kind of like know that whole process, right? Even if you're not directly doing those things. And I think that's a thing that happens in academia where people will go the extra mile to understand the other things going on, which doesn't always happen in corporate, where people will be like, that's not my job, right? You know, you deal with it. So would you say that's fair from the statistician? Yeah.
In the academic world, you know, I'm building the database, I'm writing the grant, I'm, you know, creating models, and then I'm running the stats out. I feel you get more experience in the academic world with different parts of, you know, the data science pipeline, I guess, where I don't think that's always the case in the corporate world. And I think it makes you better, like, leader.
Yeah. I like to use the phrase like end-to-end data science. It's like a little bit different from full stack, but like end-to-end, like you're talking to customers all the way to like you're productionizing code and following up. So, yeah.
This may fall on the academic part, but when you were talking about the confusion matrix, I was thinking about one of the things that I found when you get data scientists who then go to the corporate world, right? You all are very concerned about certainty, whereas businesses aren't as concerned about certainty. And so I'd be curious, kind of how do you kind of going back to that, right? Like, okay, this 1% might be wrong. That's okay in a corporate environment. It's not okay in an academic environment. But how do you communicate that better so that they understand, hey, this is not 100%. I think we see this on news, right, all the time, right? Like our polling right now with the election, right? It's not 100% certain, but it's pretty certain. And how do you communicate that to your stakeholders that you think this model is pretty right, directionally correct, but it's not perfect?
Yeah, that's a great point. So the question was, when you deal with data science, especially academia and statistics, there's a lot of uncertainty, right? You spend a lot of time reporting uncertainty versus in the corporate world, you have to be a lot more confident in your decisions, right? Kind of how do you bridge that gap of communication? Yeah, that's definitely one of the most challenging things, right? Because you get asked about deadlines that you have no way of guaranteeing, right? And I can tell you that my personal journey is I've spent a lot of time I work remotely, so most of my communications on Slack. I spend a lot of time writing a message or email that begins, I think maybe this, right? And then going back and deleting that, right? I just be like, oh, I think, yeah, this could possibly work one day, tomorrow or something like that, right? And yeah, and I totally agree that in corporate world, you have to have a risk of being wrong, right? But at the same time, it's understanding what that risk is and calling it out, right? And student doing their best to call it out. And so making confident decisions, but knowing that this is the risk and this is the kind of a fallback plan, right? So we do a lot of product merger and acquisition studies and like looking at a company that's like, it's kind of like online dating, right? I don't know how people went through that, but it's like, okay, you get like, a day, right, to figure out everything you want to know about making this, millions of dollars decision, right, or even more. And you're just like, okay, well, there's no way I can possibly know everything, right? But I can be like, okay, here's what we do know, right? And here are the risks, right, of things that we could possibly turn up as red flags, right? And then based on that, usually it's not just my call, so but kind of presenting that information like based on that, I recommend we do this, right? Even if internally, as quite frequently, I think, okay, maybe yeah, that's like 60%, right? But we're looking for 100% yes or no answer, right? That's sometimes that's what you gotta give. You just gotta call out the risks. So yeah.
So, Darwin, have you ever been burned out while working as a data scientist?
Yeah. So the question was, what are some hard skills on the other side of the coin that like I wish I knew? I think the number one, the hardest thing to transition for me was like cloud infrastructure, right? Because academia has they're not paying for cloud infrastructure. You're not gonna have AWS, you don't have GCP, right? You don't have Azure. And that was everything I know about cloud I've learned in the last 3 years on the job, right? And so yeah, so that's definitely a thing that I wish I like knew more about just because it's also just the future of doing things, right? You don't necessarily have to go and get like a cloud practitioner, spend hundreds of dollars and get a cloud practitioner certificate or anything like that, but just be able to like think about things in that way, right? And being able to think about, yeah, like I might be working with 10,000 rows in my research project, but what if I needed to work with 1 billion rows of data, right? And what that looks like. And actually, I think there's been some great talks here. I remember when I was on Spark, that was really good here as well. So just, learning about it through these like, like circles, right? Of like where you can like learn a little bit thing about this like new piece of technology. So I think there was one question on Zoom somebody wanted to ask.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask, like, have you ever been burned out while working as a data scientist in your career?
So we asked, have I ever been burned out with working as a data scientist? There are definitely days. Yeah, I think that's definitely. I mean, you can get burned out doing any job, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I will share at least one piece of advice that my dad gave me that I find very valuable. He says, when you find a career, you need something that either pays you well, you are good at, or you love, right? Ideally, you have all three, but if you can at least have two, that's not bad, right? And I know that I am good at data science, right? And generally, I think it pays pretty well, relatively. Depends on where you're at in your career, right? And then there's the love part, right? So, at the end of the day, it's kind of like finding that balance, right? Like, and for me, it's just kind of like I just remember like, I'm doing this job to make money so I can do other stuff, right? That's the job is not my life. It is the thing that I wish I enjoy every day, right? And I try to enjoy every day of it. But yeah, it's just not, it's not the end all be all, right, of what I'm doing. So,
I had one more question as well.
okay, yeah.
So, in your line of work, so is the main what is the main focus? Like, Is it on making good models or cleaning up messy data first?
Yeah, so the question is, what is in my line of work, because I guess I didn't talk too much about my company, is it most cleaning up data or is it like making models? So for us, a lot of it is kind of managing. The data definitely needs to be cleaned up a little bit. And for us, it's more about managing customer expectations and stakeholder expectations. So we are a SaaS software, so we have a lot of big companies. We have, I think, 7 of the top 10 healthcare systems, not HCA, but we'll work on that one. But yeah, so it's, you know, a lot of it is about managing expectations, you know, and then, you know, then figuring out creative ways to deliver on those expectations. And, you know, obviously cleaning data is a big part of it, right? Like most, you know, jobs are just either Excel or manipulating text files of some kind. But yeah, so, you know, but yeah, it's more, I think, about managing expectations and meeting needs. So yes. Yeah, so the question was, how do I balance being a business person, kind of being a data science person? And kind of this actually follows up to the cloud question that I answered earlier, is that is a new world to me, right? Learning how budgeting works, staffing works. You know, I'm sure you all probably know a lot more about staffing than I do. But like, you know, like infrastructure costs, right? As like a cost of business, delivering goods is like something that's really new to me. So that's something that I certainly wish I knew about earlier in my life as well, and like trying to like kind of like optimize for like that cost trade-off, right? So yeah, it's definitely something that I have like still trying to get better at. I know if I have to get to the next level, that's a thing I have to understand really well. And so yeah, so I'm very, very much still learning on that point. Yeah. Cool. I think we all, yeah, I think we all just hang out. Glenn, I feel like if I tell you that Glenn said to say thank you to me on the Zoom, it sounds very conceited. So, so I'm going to say thank you all for being such a good audience. Yeah, we'll just hang out around. I've been told that we have to be absolutely out of here by 7 o'clock. So that's 45 minutes from now, but you're welcome to hang out, have more pizza, steal some beers, you know, do all of that. So.